hypothesis, and we try to see if the data we're examining fit that hypothesis or contradict it. If they contradict it, we try to develop another hypothesis which is consistent with those data. So, of course, the reason we decided to try to separate out the intra-cycle movement from the intercycle movement was because we started with a tentative hypothesis that the demand function for money would be different within cycles, that the factors that would affect the quantity of money people hold in the short term would be different from the factors that would affect what they would hold in the long term. But let me emphasize, the problem of the demand, in our major book, in the book you're talking about, there are 2 chapters devoted to the demand curve function for money. There's also a very long chapter devoted to behavior of interest rates, which has not been involved in this at all. There's a chapter devoted to long cycles, which has not been involved in this. There's a chapter devoted to the relations between Britain and the United States, which has not been involved in this. So let me emphasize that we're talking about a very small part of a very big book.
Right.
Yes, I know that.
Brief comment, or shall we carry on to the political?
My point was that this type of transforming data from annual data to phase data was a novelty, was a new thing.
No.
When it was done, well, okay, it was not the regular thing.
I beg your pardon.
And my second point is that you choose the periodization of the model on the grounds of the monetary data, or didn't you?
No.
Or by some other method,
No.
but that is pretty subjective.
No,
method.
you're quite wrong. The periodization, the problem of breaking it down into the cycle, was pioneered by the National Bureau of Economic Research by Wesley Mitchell and Arthur Burns in a book that was published in the 1930s. The National Bureau, for decades, carried on a series of business cycles in various fields in which the concept of separating out the cyclical from the non-cyclical was a major part of it. There are dozens of books based on that technology. The dates we used for periodizing the data were the so-called reference dates chosen by the National Bureau of Economic Research on the basis of a broad series of figures. They were not dates that we chose from the monetary figures at all.
Good. Right, okay. Stefan, you haven't participated in the discussion, and no doubt that you're willing and eager to take part.
Yes, Professor Friedman, I'd like to take up some of the more political aspects of your theory. One of the main themes of your many books is the criticism of the role of government in Western society. And this comes up in various books, various works in relation to various issues. And you give many reasons for this criticism. One of the general reasons is that the bigger the government is, or the public sector, the more inefficient will the economy be. The lower rates of economic growth and lower levels of living will follow. When today we look at the empirical facts and compare societies in the Western world, we find that there are many exceptions to this. And we have cases of societies in Europe where you have a very big governments which take in a big share of the national income through taxes and duties and redistribute this again through the society, and also where you have more government regulation of the economy. I could mention, to keep this concrete, mention one society in Norway, which is close by here. In Norway, the government takes in about 50% of the national income for redistribution, spends it on schools, hospitals, old age pensions, and so on. In the United States, the government takes, for similar purposes, about 30%, just over 30%.
A little more than that. More than that.
Yes, just over. It's been increasing recently.
Well, if you take local and state governments, it's about 35%.
Yes, but the state government is around about the 30%.
Yeah,
the main issue is that this is a big difference. It's almost twice the size of the public sector in Norway is a little less than twice that of the United States. But unlike what we would expect from your theory, Norway has actually done much better than the United States in economic growth rates recently. Even if we take a longer period, like the period from 1960. this would seem to fly in the face of your theory.
Let me go back on several points. In the first place, I would like to stress that I have written two kinds of works. I have been involved in two kinds of things. One class of work has been scientific, primarily concerned with the scientific issues. Books like The Monetary History of the United States, books like The Monetary Trends that we were just talking about, a book like A Theory of the Consumption Function. Those books are not about politics. Those books do not involve any political policy. In some cases, they do involve criticism of particular government episodes. For example, in our Monetary History of the United States, I think we demonstrate very greatly that the Great Depression in the United States was largely a result of bad monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. But that's a historical observation about what actually went on. On the other hand, I have written a set of books, of which Capitalism and Freedom, Free to Choose, Tyranny of the Status Quo, all of which in association with my wife, are explicitly political. So that I regard my interest in politics as an avocation, not a vocation. I am primarily an economic scientist, I hope, and I think you will look long and hard in any of my scientific books to find the proposition you stated. It isn't in there. There's not a single word in any of those books that deals with the question of whether a big government is good, bad, or indifferent. That subject I have dealt with in the works which I regard as political. Okay, now let's turn to that.
But that's a correct reading of the political work
That's a
you've
correct
done.
reading of the political works. I'm not questioning that. I'm just trying to make the distinction.
Yes.
Because I think it's very easy for people to confuse the two and not to recognize that
Perhaps I should
there's a
have-
broad science of economics,
Perhaps I
which
should
is
have said-
non-political. I should explain to you.
Some of your
Take the monetary theory.
I just wanted to say that some of your followers in this country deliberately try to confuse your scientific criteria with.
Well,
with
they're
your
not here at the
political-
moment to answer for themselves.
Let me answer for me. I'll talk for me.
yes.
And let me point out to you that so far as my monetary theory is concerned, it has been followed in China, in communist China, as well as in capitalist Britain or capitalist Japan. The monetary theory in particular is a non-political theory. Karl Marx was a quantity theorist, so it really has no political content. On the other hand, the point you make is a valid point. I do believe that in and of itself, a large government sector is a factor which is adverse both to political freedom and economic prosperity. Now, the question of the circumstances under which a large government sector will do harm and how large it has to be to do harm depends very much on a number of considerations. One of those, a very important consideration, is the homogeneity of a society. A large government sector will do less harm in a relatively homogeneous society than it will in a heterogeneous society, because in a homogeneous society, people tend to want more or less the same thing, their values are much the same, and therefore that group of people can more readily agree on what government can do with less division from it. A second very important factor that is particularly relevant to countries like Iceland, like Norway, like Sweden, is the extent to which they are open economies, open to the rest of the world, and dependent on foreign trade. Both Norway and Sweden have been very largely open economies in which they have had a very large sector of international trade, as Iceland does. It's a very large international trade. And that means, with respect to that sector, government can't mess it up. There's a world market in which they operate. They are subject to international competition. It's interesting to note that in Sweden, where in the last 5 years or so, government has been much more involved than it was before in that sector, Sweden is having increasing economic difficulties. It's very far. There are very few people in Sweden today who would give the kind of universal approval to what's going on there that they gave 15, 20 years ago. Now you come to Norway. You left out of your description of Norway one very, very important fact. You know what that is. That's the discovery of oil. And of course, the discovery of oil in the North Sea is a bonanza which enabled. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy.